Free games in the past have always been a bit of a toss-up, but 2016 has given us some pretty good ones. Today, GameRanks brings you our top 10 free games of 2016. Number 10, Atlas Reactor is an interesting game that you can play the beta of right now if you want. As I said in another video, we did probably the best summary I can give if you combine XCOM with Overwatch. It's a turn-based tactical PvP game that I think you'll find surprisingly interesting if you give it a shot. It kind of scratches an itch that I feel like I get whenever I do play XCOM. XCOM is not an arcade-oriented game, and turn-based games typically don't feel arcade-oriented really on the whole, but Atlas Reactor kind of gives you a competitive arcade feeling situation while still being a turn-based tactical game, and I really enjoy it. Number 9 is Adventure Communist, which is the official sequel to Adventure Capitalist. Just like its predecessor, the game is a clicker, although there's a lot more depth to it than that. Some clickers can be total garbage, but this brings in some nice simulation elements that, combined with the humor, really make for a more interesting experience than you would expect when I said this is a clicker. And builds on a lot of the things that that game brought to the table, except for something that I think some people will probably like a lot more. Although it may seem like a turnoff at first, it kind of does its microtransaction prompting at the start of the game and then lets you be if you just avoid it. Whereas with Adventure Capitalist, it kind of went the other way around. You would progress a while, and then in order to continue progressing, you needed to do the microtransactions. So on that front, I think definitely an improvement. It's in early access right now, and there are a couple of issues with the games, particularly with saving. There have been reports of people losing their data, but overall, this is a shining example of this type of game. Number 8, Mandagon is a platform that looks maybe a bit reminiscent to Fez, however, it is a lot faster in pacing and more oriented to fetch quests. It also doesn't have any kind of 3D mechanic whatsoever. It is a traditional platformer, and the game itself is loosely based in Tibetan philosophy. Essentially, you're finding tablets and returning them to shrines. This is a short game, only take you about a half hour to an hour to get the whole thing done, depending on how much depth you want to go into. But it's a lovely game. It's extremely well crafted. Seriously, the art and level design are both top-notch. And for a free game that literally does nothing at all to try to get you to buy anything, literally anything, this is definitely worth your time. Number 7, Paladins, which is kind of like Overwatch. However, it has a much more fantasy-oriented slant to it. And I wouldn't call it exactly a clone of Overwatch on account its scoring system is actually quite a bit different. I would say just a bit more on the traditional side as far as that goes. But the idea of every hero having a different role and playing its part in each battle does sort of come through in the same way here. Being this one, though, is free to play versus Overwatch's $60, this one is a little bit more concentrated on the microtransactions, although it's kind of irritating that a $60 game like Overwatch has microtransactions in it. It's at least a little bit understandable here on account you get a game for free, however, it's still annoying. Like, microtransactions are never going to not be annoying, but as far as free to play goes, if you're not really wanting to buy Overwatch or don't have the money to buy Overwatch, this is a very good substitute for it, and it has every bit as much a personality as Overwatch. Number 6, Warface 2016 Anubis is a free-to-play first-person shooter that has both co-op and player versus player modes, and is really fun. Like, it handles incredibly well, and it plays much more like a top-tier game than you'd expect out of a free-to-play. There are a couple of minor gripes I have. First is that there are a lot of hackers. And I know I'm not the only one who will complain about this in the world, but there are times when this is just taken over by people who are hacking the game. And the other one is that unless you're willing to put in literally an obscene amount of time into the game, this is a pay-to-win game. Now, that being said, people who really like putting lots and lots of time into a game and aren't terribly upset by essentially a long grind, this is a well-made game. Hopefully it becomes a little bit more balanced in the future, but the good stuff makes it really hard to ignore. Number 5, WildStar is an MMO that I think, in my opinion, is a lot more interesting than your typical MMO because it takes the combat a little bit further. It's a lot more skill-oriented than luck-oriented, and I dig the more real-time feel. Also, this game has an absolutely dynamite graphical style. It is such a pretty game and takes fantasy and sci-fi and mixes them in such a way that it comes off as completely unique. Obviously, it's a sum of its parts, but I don't think that it's been employed like this anywhere else. It's beautiful. Absolutely a stunning game. Number 4, Paragon is another team hero shooter, again in the vein of Overwatch, that really goes out of its way to make it so you don't have to do microtransactions. Now, that being said, they are there, and when they're there, the intent is to give you motivation to buy things, but still, you can play this game without spending money and still do quite well. Now, this one is balanced, probably even a little bit better than Overwatch in my opinion, because there is almost never a quote-unquote standout player. It's always a team effort in this game, and this is by far the best looking out of all of these style games, using the Unreal 4 engine and also standing out stylistically, going just slightly more realistic than a lot of the Overwatch and its competitors look. Number 3, Evolve Stage 2 is a free-to-play Evolve. Now, if you're not familiar, Evolve is essentially an asynchronous player versus player game, where it's usually monster versus team of players. Sometimes it's monster versus one player, depends on how many people are on. That's an exaggeration. Now, what they've done is made a game that's just a bit more streamlined this time around. It could get a little bit complicated regarding your weapons, and they've kind of brought that back in scale a bit, which I like a lot. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that I partially want to support this game based on the fact that the idea of Evolve is better than the execution of both versions of Evolve. That's not to say this one isn't better, and it is improving. It's more enjoyable now than it ever was, that's for certain. And it keeps getting better, but it's just not quite there yet. That being said, there isn't another game that is like this. This is pretty much it. And that's part why I care about it. I like the idea of it continuing to develop and eventually getting to where, okay, this is exactly what it should be. It's easy to waste a lot of time in it, despite these imperfections. Number 2, Duelist is a game that plays something like a tactical RPG combined with a collectible card game, and at times feels like a much prettier game that owes a lot to Hearthstone and Final Fantasy Tactics style games. The developers have done a very large amount to ensure that skill is a factor more so than luck, and essentially ask that as you play, you build a strategy that will eventually come to a conclusion against your opponent. Duelist also gives you the satisfaction of some of the best animation in a pixel art style game that I've seen, period. And as I said in another video, I've been playing this since the very first alpha release, and it's progressed a lot since then. I'm particularly excited that it's also coming to PS4, Xbox One, and mobile, so a lot more people are going to be enjoying this thing. And finally, number 1 is Gwent, the card game from The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Gwent is a 3-tier, turn-based, class-based collectible card game that I got surprisingly into while playing The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. So much so that it became a distraction, and when I finally wanted to finish The Witcher 3, it kinda needed to stop playing Gwent. I needed to tell myself, stop playing Gwent. I have a feeling they knew that people were doing this, because to make a completely separate experience that plays exactly the same, albeit a lot more depth-oriented, is a smart move. Gwent requires a lot of bluffing and skill-oriented judgment calls that I think make it one of the more fun card games out there, because it's not overtly complex, but it requires you to know a lot more than it might lead on to. Free games, what's got your attention? Let's hear that in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, now is a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every single day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.